Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Library of Virginia. I'm Catherine Fitzgerald Wyatt, the Education and Outreach Manager here at the library, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this noontime book talk with A.D. Nauman, who will discuss her historical fiction novel, Down the Steep, with us today. Set in the Civil Rights era in Southeast Virginia, Down the Steep is the story of Willa McCoy, the teenage daughter of a Klansman who learns to overcome her own racism. When Willa learns a devastating secret that forces her to see her father's true character, the once loyal daughter rebels. The book investigates how we grow as people and overcome prejudice while navigating the complexities of our need to belong. A.D. Nauman is a Chicago author whose short fiction has appeared in Chicago Quarterly Review, Willow Springs, Tri-Quarterly, Necessary Fiction, The Literary Review, and many other journals. Her dystopian novel, Scorch, was published in 2001 and re-released in 2019. Nauman is an Illinois Arts Council Literary Award recipient whose work has been produced by Stories on Stage and broadcast on NPR. Though now a Midwesterner, Nauman grew up mostly in Tidewater, Virginia, and I think she's got some folks she grew up here with her today. Before I ask her to come to the podium, I wanted to mention that next week on Wednesday, March 20th, the library will host an evening panel discussion reflecting on the 100th anniversary of the Racial Integrity Act in support of our current exhibition, Indigenous Perspectives. I encourage you to walk through the gallery before you leave if you haven't been through yet. Check out our calendar of events online for more details on other upcoming programs at the library. We would also love to get your feedback on today's program. We have evaluation cards on the information table out in the lobby, and we would appreciate it if you could fill them out as they give the library information on marketing and planning future events. A.D. Nauman will be signing copies of Down the Steep after the program in the lobby, and copies can be purchased in the library shop. Please join me in welcoming A.D. Nauman.
That was a wonderful, thorough introduction, and she actually took one of my slides, all the information, so that's cool. I can skip that. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming today, and thank you to the Library of Virginia for hosting me. It's fabulous to see some old friends as well as new faces. So as Catherine mentioned, I am the author of Down the Steep. It's a historical novel set in Southeast Virginia, where I mostly grew up, although somehow I have ended up in the Midwest. So this is my second novel. The first novel I published 20 years ago, but in the interim, I've been writing short stories, raising my daughter, who is now thoroughly raised, and working my day job, which I absolutely love. I teach at a university, but not in an English department, which is what you would expect of writers. My field is literacy education. So basically, I teach licensed classroom teachers, K through 12, how to better teach reading and writing to their students. It's wonderful and inspiring, and the people I work with are fantastic. But it is in Chicago. This is where I live. This is Oak Park. I live in this little suburb of Chicago. This is where I used to live. So you can see why perhaps I would be interested in writing about Southeast Virginia. It's nicer to have that picture in my head than the other one. Okay. So before I proceed, juggling here. What comes to mind when you hear the phrase civil rights era? Just take a moment and think about it. And maybe if you're sitting near somebody, turn and share with them something that came to mind. Yeah, well, Down the Steep is set in the civil rights era. And just as a refresher, it is set in a fictitious small town in Tidewater or Southeast Virginia. It's somewhat south of the peninsula. And it's about Willa McCoy, who is a racist who worships her father, who is high up in the local Ku Klux Klan. And she adores him. She wants to be just like him. But as the events of the story unfold, she realizes what a deeply flawed man he is. And this allows her to start questioning her own beliefs and overcome her own racism. So down the steep, by the way, I had no idea this was going to be so gigantic on this screen. So if you're visually impaired, we're taking care of you here. Down the Steep reads like a memoir, but it is fiction. So it is fiction, but it is also rooted in my own childhood experiences. This is my family between 63 and 67. This is me. This is a little Yami, my very first stuffed animal. And there's my sister who's sitting right there in the front row. So my father was a minister of a congregational church in Franklin, Virginia, which you probably all know about. However, my mother grew up in Minnesota. My father grew up in California. So we were somewhat outsiders. And while we lived there, my parents were doing some quiet things to support the civil rights movement. They were not loud activists or anything, but they were quietly trying to lend a hand. The town in my novel is Kingsfield, and it's fictitious, but it's an amalgam of towns down in that area, Franklin, Smithfield. I sort of glommed some of them together. So in 67, we left the area, we moved to Philadelphia, then we moved back to Tidewater to Newport News in 73 and stayed till 84. And I'm telling you this because this is why I say I mostly grew up in the region. I don't want to like misrepresent myself. But we all left in 1984. My mother went back to the Midwest, my father to the West. We scattered all over the country. But over the years, my mother and I would reminisce about our time in Franklin. And periodically she would say, there were Klan members in that church. And that kind of sat in my memory for many, many years and decades. And then it started to grow into a story. I started work on the novel during the Obama era, when people were saying, oh, we're in a post-racial society, everything's okay now. I felt that that was probably not true. I was feeling a strong undercurrent of racism and sexism sort of bubbling up under the surface. And well, sure enough, that was true. It bubbled up. As I wrote the novel, I realized it was turning into a bit of a thought experiment. The thought experiment was, how would a white person born into a very virulently racist culture overcome those beliefs and so I created Willa. I thought about what it might take to uproot her belief system and basically kind of followed her on her journey. And this is what Willa's journey taught me, that first you start with, you begin with some awareness of unfairness or discrimination in her own life. And for Willa, it was sexism. Then she's exposed to a different perspective. A stranger comes to town. Importantly, that different perspective comes from a person who is caring. She's a caring mentor. So she's not wagging her finger in her face. Don't you say this, don't you say that. She's also forced into proximity with the other. She spends time in the presence of a young Black man. But even after all that, I felt like that might not be enough to uproot that prejudice. So then there had to be a fracturing, some sort of traumatic fracturing from the source of that, of her old beliefs, which felt to her traumatic. So I don't want to give away too much of the story, but that was what the thought experiment brought up. I feel that the setting of the story is extremely important. The place is very important. Because what I have found out from hanging around people who grew up in the North is they have this very stereotypical idea of the South. They think it's Basically, they think it's all Alabama. They think it's one big thing and it's just all Alabama. And I wanted to be as specific as possible in writing about the South, Southeast Virginia, which is a unique place. And this is so pretty. It's very unique. So I'm going to read to you now just a few pages from the novel, from the opening of the novel. Okay. So this is the beginning. This is chapter 1. And again, remember, it reads like a memoir. When I was 13 years old in 1963, I realized some people in this world are extras, born to be peripheral, and I was one of them. My parents had 4 children, boy, girl, girl, boy. As girl number 2, I served as a backdrop if anything happened to girl number 1. Worse, it was clear my parents had wanted another boy. They'd planned to name the new baby William without bothering to choose a girl's name, and when I turned out to be me, they lazily named me Willa. After my little brother Billy was born, they quit having kids. We lived in Southeast Virginia in the low-lying coastal region known as the Tidewater. Our town was small but bigger than its neighbors, its industry hardy thanks to lumber, hogs, and peanuts. In summer, the air hung thick as a swamp, rattling with insects. The smell of sawdust and tree lilies mingled with the rotting cabbage stench of the paper mill. I used to fly my bike up Main Street through our downtown, 5 blocks of white-painted brick facade. Across the Blackwater River was the lumber yard, where towers of skinny pine logs rose up beside stacks of slender sheets of wood. "That's what will become of you," I'd say out loud to the logs, then zoom past them toward the peanut silo, embossed with its monocled cartoon peanut kicking up a merry leg. Beyond the silo, hunched along the railroad tracks, were shacks cobbled together with scraps of wood, corrugated plexiglass, and pieces of billboard sign. This was where the most impoverished Black people lived. Of course, in that place and time, all the African Americans were extras, part of the blurred backdrop erected for those standing center stage. Blacks who behaved well were allowed to serve whites. Tidewater was where the first shackled Africans were brought in 1619 to be sold as slaves, though that fact did not tend to come up in polite conversation, and our conversation was always polite. We were a gracious folk, eager to distinguish ourselves from those coarse inhabitants of the Deep South. Tidewater was not a place where churches blew up or police battered marchers with water hoses on national television. Southeast Virginians were descendants of the first ever Brits to land in the New World, settlers who'd lived in Jamestown, who'd met Pocahontas. In my hometown, Kingsfield, people felt their worth. They also understand the value of avoiding trouble, and so they offered a restrained sort of benevolence to their coloreds. Colors was what we called Black people back then in polite society. Other times, I am ashamed to say, we called them the N-word, a word I refuse to use now. On my bike, I would soar up High Street, past the sprawling white clapboard houses with wide lawns of purple phlox and azaleas, through puddles of shade cast by grand weeping willows. In June, the crepe myrtles would bloom in their astonishing red and purple pinks. The trunks of crepe myrtles split at the base into a chaos of pale gray stems. And when I lived in Kingsfield, gardeners debated the proper treatment of them. Some insisted on pruning the trees down to 3 or 4 even trunks, while others believed the bloom was fuller when the trees grew free from the human impulse toward uniformity. It seems likely this debate continues, but I don't know. When I was 14, I destroyed our family, and my parents sent me away, and I have never been back. I was, after all, only an extra. Thank you. So I call this a literary historical novel, and literary fiction explores themes and questions more so than other genres might. And here are some of the themes I wanted to explore in Down the Steep. First of all, the importance of a sense of belonging. And when does that sense of belonging, or when does that need to belong, turn into tribalism, and why? So maybe I'm a member of the chess club and you're on in the tennis club, and it seems like we should be able to coexist happily. But what if the tennis club starts to get more attention, and maybe the tennis club is raising more money, and the chess club starts to feel some animosity, and then the chess club sets up their tables on the tennis courts. I'm sure there are many, many mechanisms by which two opposing groups can start to feel animosity toward one another. I also wanted to explore the impact of culture, and especially the culture of our own families, on our identity, because we absorb beliefs, attitudes, and assumptions from the people around us. And then how do we reach a point where we are able to question that received wisdom, what everyone says? So how do we check ourselves regularly and ask ourselves, why do I think what I think? Is it because everyone says so? Why do they think what they think? This is not necessarily something that comes easy to people. And now let's talk about historical fiction. Woohoo! Here's a fun fact. The first ever novel to be called historical fiction was, does anyone know? Anyone take a guess? Who said it? Oh, okay. It was Ivanhoe. Who remembers Ivanhoe? Who knows? Published in 1819. I don't think I ever read Ivanhoe, by Sir Walter Scott. Obviously, history is a giant category. You can write about the 1950s or the 1910s. The 1510s would be considered historical fiction. And there's 500 BC. You can go all the way back. I think when you get this far back, it becomes more fantasy than historical fiction. But it's popular. It's very, very popular. And I think about why it's so popular. I think so many readers are attracted to it because it can fire on all four syllables. It can be a method of escapism, which is one reason why people like to read. It usually is realism. So it contains characters who can be related to. They're relatable. You learn information, facts about that time period. And that's another very gratifying thing when you're reading. And then it makes big historical events feel more personal. Maybe it feels like you have more control over them. So many benefits. It deepens our understanding of history, showing its impact on individual lives. It helps us to see history from different perspectives than those that are usually encapsulated in standard textbooks, including people of color and women. It can also spark a reader's interest in a particular time period and motivate him or her to read more about it, including nonfiction. And for all these reasons, it's a wonderful genre for kids. So those of you who have children or grandchildren, buy them historical fiction for their birthdays. And it's also it's become a popular genre to write. I like it for the sheer joy of researching and learning. But this is a funny kind of a reason, but I have found this to be quite important. So it takes a really long time to write a novel, and it takes a really long time to publish a novel. And so years and years go by, and then the book is finally out, and and your book has a flip phone in it. This is very annoying. So it can avoid this rapidly changing technology issue by just being set in the past. For literary fiction writers, I think it's appealing because we often engage in social commentary, and history illuminates the present day injustices. The past explains the present. This is kind of an interesting thing that I came across. Alexander Menschel is an academic who wrote a book about writing backwards. It was published recently, and he investigates historical fiction. And according to him, in the 1980s, the literary establishment decided that they wanted to intentionally be more inclusive of authors of color and other minoritized groups. And at that time, Toni Morrison's Beloved appeared, and it provided a kind of gateway for other authors of color. And according to Menschel, so historical fiction written by authors of color was an acceptable genre to both sides of the political spectrum. I just think this is really interesting, because for those of us who lean liberal, we feel like, oh, we're unearthing forgotten voices and stories. But for those who lean conservative, there's this subtle implication that, oh, this is how it was in the past. Isn't this horrible? But now it's better. Isn't this great? It's all fixed now. And it also can be used as a way to kind of minimize current injustice. So, okay, ladies, don't stop complaining. Once you didn't have the right to vote. And now, look, you can get a credit card in your own name. So stop this whining. Also interesting, according to Menschel, is most historical fiction these days falls into a limited number of specific categories. And here they are. I think this is really interesting. The Holocaust and World War II still gets an awful lot of fiction written about it. And then recent history, I suppose that's the category mine would fall into. So what makes historical fiction good? You'd pause and think about that for a moment while I take a sip. What makes it good? Well, here's what I think makes it good. Here's what I appreciate about historical fiction that I think is good. If I stand way back here, then the thing's not so giant. Okay. In good historical fiction, I think the history is more than a backdrop, and it's more than product placements. Unfortunately, some authors who write historical fiction fall into a kind of trap where they're trying to set the scene, and they do it by dropping in all kinds of names of the weird products that used to be in that time, and it looks like a list of, I don't know, it looks like a shopping list. And the author illustrates how past cultural beliefs and realities impact the lives of individuals at the time. I mean, think about the primitive medical care and, of course, the horror of no cell phones. So basically, this story wouldn't work if it were plunked into a different historical period. And what people thought in the past is clearly contrasted with what we think now. But to me, the most important ingredient in historical fiction is accuracy. Careful world building is essential. And I think that authors are responsible for doing it with as much fidelity as we possibly can. Because this is how historical fiction is how most people are going to learn history, especially young people. And obviously, this isn't just books. This is also movies and TV shows. So I feel like historical accuracy is important in all of those media. How do you build a world? I love that phrase, world building. Well, you do lots and lots of research. And I thought I would spend the rest of the talk, another 10 minutes or so, talking about how I researched for Down the Steep and also some of the really interesting things I learned. Well, first of all, I read lots of books, both nonfiction and fiction. Here are some of my favorites. Edward Baptist's The Half Has Never Been Told. This is a comprehensive history of slavery in the US. It's grim. It's not a beach read. Do not get this book and take it to the beach with you this summer. Ellie Saslow's Rising Out of Hatred is the true story of a white nationalist the son of a white nationalist who overcame his racism. So it's sort of like the true story parallel to my book. And this kid was born to white supremacists in Florida not that long ago. He was homeschooled, so he grew up in this sort of bubble of white supremacy. Then he decided he wanted to study medieval English history, as one does. And ironically, he found a great program at one of the most liberal schools in Florida that you can find. It was the university that Ron DeSantis has been dismantling, the new college in Florida. So he goes to college, and there he is in this giant pool of diverse people and getting to know all kinds of people. And after marinating in that for enough years, he realizes, you know, my old beliefs aren't right. So he disavowed it. And then finally, this was an interesting book, Nancy Eisenberg's White Trash. The subtitle says it all. It's the history of class in America. It talks about the people whose ancestors came over to the US as indentured servants versus those whose ancestors came over to, you know, to buy up land and for other reasons. And how those people kind of got stuck in the class track that they're in. I also read magazines from the era. This was fun. And some trashy magazines too, I found. True Romance, I read a few stories in that one. No Good Men, it's the precursor to Lifetime and Hallmark movies, I think. And then this is a tip that Rebecca McCoy gave me. She said, find an old catalog, an old Sears catalog from the period you're writing about and just look through it. So I did that. I was fortunate. I found it. And in it, I discovered little boys wore cowboy shirts, which is a detail in my novel. Here are the ladies rocking the fashions and the hairdos. Shoot. And I learned a bit more about the technology of the time. And then I threw this up here just for fun. I don't know anyone who had a toilet this color, but you know, maybe you guys, your grandparents or great grandparents, that pink one. There you go. So one researches for historical novels, not only for details, although they're obviously important, but also to understand how that context shaped the people in it. Because this affects characters' beliefs and motivations, and that shapes plots, and that impacts theme. Other sources, local newspapers from the early 1960s in Tidewater. This was sort of pivotal. So several years ago now, I don't know, 4 years ago, my sister and I went back to Franklin, went to the public library, and the very nice librarian found these old newspapers for us on microfiche. So we sat and we looked at them on microfiche, and just from that, I picked up a few key details for my novel. First of all, in one of the newspapers, there was an editorial on should we repeal the poll tax, 1963. And then also there was a section in the newspaper, this is a local newspaper to Franklin, a section called Women in the News, and it was all about the social goings on and who was invited to whose birthday party, literally. And there was also a section less often published called Coloreds in the News, and it was all about what was going on in the colored community. Obviously the internet. My parents shared some memories with me. Older friends shared memories of the time period. Movies about and from that time period were fun to watch. And this is my favorite, old TV commercials on YouTube. Treat yourself tonight. Look up some old commercials from the early 1960s. All right. So I'm going to wrap up the talk with some important understandings that I feel like I gleaned from my research. First of all, I felt like I learned a lot about the nature of white supremacy. Notably that it comes in waves, it's never completely gone. I mean, that's one thing we forget when we don't study history. It rises and falls and then rises up again and falls and it comes back. It's not like, oh, once that was a problem, but now we fixed it. That's not how it goes. It looks for whatever might justify it. It's really good at confirmation bias. So it roots around in science or religion or whatever field and finds things to justify its existence. You can find pieces of the ideology floating around in different movements today in the US with different names. It's inherently misogynist. And by this, I don't mean that only men are white supremacists. The women white supremacists are also misogynist. It's like those of you who might remember Phyllis Schlafly, she was going around doing public talks about how women should not speak in public. Okay. It's misogynist because it seeks to establish these rigid hierarchies of people. And of course, men have to be at the top. And of course, white men have to be at the top. White wealthy men have to be at the top. And because it rejects equality, it looks for those hierarchies. It also ends up rejecting democracy to some extent, leaning instead toward autocracy or oligarchy. I also learned about the impact of Brown versus the Board of Education, which was the Supreme Court ruling in 1954 that made segregation illegal. It sparked a surge in Klan activity through the South. So right after World War II, Klan activity had died down a bit because everyone was so horrified by the Holocaust that no, we're not going to engage in that. So it was dormant for a while. And here it is back. Virginia had a lot of interesting ways of trying to avoid integration. They tried to just ignore the Supreme Court ruling. A couple states are doing that today. And then passive resistance was they passed all kinds of bizarre little Byzantine laws that made it difficult for Black families to enroll their children in white schools. So you had to live a certain distance from the school, and you had, if there's one that was fewer steps, it was difficult to navigate that system of laws. So we needed another Supreme Court ruling in '68 to achieve meaningful desegregation. Also involved a case in Virginia. And then in 1991, the Supreme Court is back again, this time ruling that we don't need court-ordered desegregation anymore. It's all fixed. No worries. And so the result was a backslide of efforts to integrate. Today, US schools are actually more segregated than they have been since 1968. In '68, 77% of Black students attended majority non-white schools. Today, it's 81%, or in 2018, it was 81%. I want y'all to know that the South is actually the least segregated of any place in the US. The South leads the nation in desegregation for African-American students. Oh, here's a cool chart. I thought y'all might like a cool chart. People who like libraries tend to like charts. So the red line is the South and desegregating. You could see it dropping and then rising again. But look at the Northeast. That's the purple one. What the heck? Well, we know, obviously, that segregation is tied to gaps in housing and income. So all the Black and Latino students get concentrated in high poverty areas, and then they go to that school. But this was interesting. There's also a clever strategy of municipalities to remove themselves from a larger school district to form their own smaller school district, which almost always creates more racial and socioeconomic segregation. There's a picture of a Chicago public school. It's very bright and colorful, and you'll notice all the children are Black. All right. And finally, my research into Nat Turner's rebellion. This is an important story that gets told repeatedly in the novel. And I wanted to find out the true history of it. One reason why it felt important to me was because it occurred 10 miles from Franklin. And my father would tell us about it when we were kids. my father was a little weird. Why was he telling us that story when we were 5-year-olds? I don't know. But so one thing, it's also called the Southampton Insurrection. Nat Turner was a slave. And in 1831, he staged a rebellion with a group of his enslaved friends. He was a very smart man who, as a boy, was taught to read by the mistress of his house. And he read the Bible over and over again and became a preacher and concluded that the Bible said people weren't supposed to be slaves. So he wanted to lead a slave rebellion and lead his people out of slavery, which indeed is in the Bible. There are so many different accounts of this story. It's still unclear how many white people were murdered, somewhere between 55 and 65. The brutality of this rebellion was pretty shocking because the slaves who participated did not have access to guns. They had knives and axes and scythes, machetes. So they hacked people to death. So it was just incredibly gruesome. And it is true that a large percentage of the victims were children. So it was indeed very shocking. But I'd like to invite you to think about different ways to interpret that brutality. So to a white supremacist, this might be evidence, it's empirical evidence that these Black people are bestial and uncivilized. But you could also look at it as this is a mirror reflection, a mirror image of the trauma that slavery inflicts upon people who are enslaved. So it's a response that's not, I wouldn't call it justifiable, but I would call it understandable. And then the response was even more brutal. The rebellion was put down in about a day and a half. And then the white plantation owners got really scared about slave rebellions. And in fact, Thomas Jefferson was famously very nervous about slaves rebelling. He knew Haiti, this had happened in Haiti, and he was really nervous about this happening in the US. And the Black people outnumbered the white people in the South. So there was this fear, and hundreds of Black people were murdered by white people just for walking down the street because they were suspected of being part of an uprising when they weren't, until a general had to tell people to stop, to tell white people to stop doing that. And I bring this up, and I included this in my presentation today because I think it underscores the legacy we have of fearing Black people. I think that it is etched deep in the American psyche that Black people are dangerous. Watch out. And a group of Black teenage boys on a corner looks really scary compared with a group of white teenage boys on the corner. I think this is something deeply ingrained in our upbringing and something to definitely fight against. Sometimes the clicker doesn't cooperate. All right. Last few things to say. In essence, my research was a search for the roots of our current day culture wars. And I thought that it was going to take me to the 1960s because they were so important because, well, we know why. But of course, in fact, the roots go much deeper. The roots go all the way back to 1619. And frankly, they probably go back even further. Here was my ultimate realization, that the root of our culture wars today lies in the tension between two views of what makes America special. We can view it either as a place where we all strive toward a more perfect union, equality for all, regardless of your demographic group, or as a land of opportunity, where we all strive toward individual prosperity unfettered by restrictions or too many restrictions. I believe we've been taught that these two views are compatible, but often they aren't. Because one view seeks to equalize people while the other seeks to stratify them. into owners, managers, workers, upper, middle, lower. And to the extent that these two can be in conversation with one another, I think we do okay. It's when they're not in conversation with one another that I think we get pretty testy. And that concludes my talk. Love to hear your thoughts.
I have a microphone for anyone who has any questions.
When your father told the story of Nat Turner's rebellion, who were the good guys and who were the bad guys?
That's a great question. There it was Nat Turner and his buddies. I mean, I don't know what to call them. His fellow marauders were definitely the bad guy. He didn't say that, so he didn't state that, but it was always, oh, here's what they did, and that was really scary. And he told me later that he and a friend went around to the plantations where the rebellion took place, and they were standing empty. It was definitely a watch out for these dangerous people kind of a message. Yeah, okay.
Parents, I'm sorry, realizing that we were on the South's side and that they believed in slavery, and saying something to my father about, we were on that side and we supported slavery. And he said, well, the slaves were treated a lot better than the orphans in Dickens' day. And at the time, I was like 11 or something. It made me feel better. It made sense as a child that, that was his apology for slavery, was that, well, somebody else was treated worse someplace else.
That's interesting. I do know that one of the objections during the Civil War, some Southerners were saying, look at how badly the immigrants are being treated up north in the factories. And that was true. That was true. That wasn't untrue, but that's not obviously a justification.
You were telling me a few more details about Nat Turner's understanding when so a town near Franklin used to be called.
Used to be called Jerusalem. Yeah. And so his idea was he was going to lead his band to Jerusalem, and that would be the spark for freeing all the slaves. It looked like he may have been, a little mentally disturbed, or not. Those were the accounts. Maybe he was completely rational and he was trying to escape slavery, because why wouldn't you do that? There was one account I read one that said it's not known why he did it. Yes. There's a lovely lady back there who has a question.
I know you were noticing the differences and pointing to the Chicago schools and Illinois and the situation up there. And so I just wondered if you were going to write another historical fiction novel about someone overcoming their own racism set in Chicago, what would the differences perhaps be?
Yeah. Ooh. Probably not a lot. They'd be wearing coats more often. Yeah, because I think that those steps that I went through with my character Willa probably would apply anywhere. However, they do sit up north complaining, oh, these Southerners are so racist. And that's not me. We're not racist. You Southerners who are. So that would be a difference. Maybe they're worse than we are, so that's, it's like the orphans in Dickens.
Any thoughts on how we can apply the factors that led Willa to think on her own on a broader scale in our world, in our country?
Yeah. Well, one thing that I've been thinking about for quite a while is how in 2020, after George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement really exploded across the country, there were a lot of white people saying, well, they think we're so privileged, but look, we have it terrible. And most of them do, you know. It's true that virtually all wealthy people in the US are white, but not all white people in the US are wealthy. And when you're in that lower socioeconomic class, you are also at a disadvantage. So I mean, I dream of, in my fantasy head, being able to tap into that sense of, yeah, you're right, that's not fair. You're treated badly. And look how badly the Black people are being treated. It's actually worse. I mean, at least you're going to survive. You might complain that, maybe a Black person's going to get the job I wanted, but you have a better chance of surviving the drive to the interview than the Black person does. And it's also contextual. I mean, there does seem to be this belief in the world that Black people have all these advantages. And in certain contexts, that actually is true. For instance, if at the university, if you had a white candidate and a Black candidate applying for a job, there would be special attention given to the Black candidate to make sure that you're giving them fair treatment. But as my sister pointed out once, it's like a handicap parking spot. Like, oh yeah, you get this nice parking spot, but in the rest of your life, you still have this handicap. So yeah, so we're not, we do in the US just a terrible job facing our history.
Talk about Willa overcoming her racism, but can you really overcome it, or is it you start on a lifelong journey?
Thank you for asking that question. Yes, it's a lifelong journey. And at the end of the book, when Willa's older, an adult, she talks about the little pits she still falls into. At one point, she's got some Black friends at college, and she's, oh, look at me, I've got Black friends, and she realizes, well, this is this is just sort of an annoying form of racism too. So yeah, and she talks about how you have to be ever vigilant in what you're thinking, because it is so deeply culturally ingrained. When I first started writing the character of Willa, first of all, I was kind of appalled by her because she had to start out life being racist. And I was thinking, great, I'm writing this racist girl. This is really awful. But then I kind of naively thought, well, how am I going to put myself in the place of this racist? Well, it was awfully easy to channel the cultural racism. It was awfully easy to bring those words to mind and bring those attitudes to mind because, even people like us who grew up liberal and we think we're, above this, no, we really are in it. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Really appreciate it.